The letter had been read so many times that the fold lines had gone soft, the paper thinning at the creases the way old cloth does when it has been worried between too many fingers. Wren Calloway had not meant to memorize it, but somewhere between the third reading and the 12th, the words had settled into her without her permission, the way certain things do when a person has very little else to hold on to. She read it one final time on the last morning of her old life, standing at the window of a rented room she would not be returning to, the light coming in gray and thin through glass that had never been properly cleaned. Outside, the street was already moving, carts and voices and the particular indifference of a town that had decided it was done with her. She did not look out. She looked at the letter. I am not a good man to live with. I want to say that plainly before you make any decision. I work from before sunrise until after dark, and I do not always remember to speak. The ranch is in a hard country, and the winters are longer than they look on a map. I cannot promise you comfort. I cannot promise you much of anything. But I will not lie to you, and I will not let you go hungry. And if you decide to come, I will be at the gate when the coach arrives. If you decide not to, I will understand that too, and I will not hold it against you. The name of the place is Vess Ranch. The name of the man writing this is Roland Vess. I do not write letters well. I hope this one is enough. It was not a romantic letter. It did not try to be. That was precisely why Wren had answered it. She had received other letters in the weeks after the notice appeared in the Eastern paper. Letters from men who promised her a new life and a good home and happiness beyond what she had known. Letters written in the language of advertisements, full of certainty and shine. She had read each one with the particular attention of a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, to notice the space between what people said and what they meant. Rosalind Vess had not promised her happiness. He had promised not to lie. In the landscape of her recent life, that was the rarest thing she had been offered. She folded the letter one more time and placed it in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, against her ribs, where she could feel it when she breathed. The coach took 3 days. Wren sat with her back straight and her hands folded and watched the world outside the window change, slowly and then all at once, from the tight, crowded geography she had known her whole life, into something vast and pale and indifferent to human presence. The land did not welcome her. It did not threaten her either. It simply continued, enormous and unhurried, as though the coach and everyone in it were too small to merit acknowledgement. She found that she did not mind this. There was something restful about a landscape that did not look at you. She carried 2 bags. One held her clothes and the small practical items she had kept when everything else was sold or surrendered. The other held a single object wrapped in a square of linen, a ledger book, new and completely empty, its pages unwritten, its spine uncracked. She had bought it with the last of her wages on the morning her employer had told her, with practiced regret, that he could no longer keep her on. She had carried it since then without opening it. She was not sure what she intended to do with it, but she had not been able to leave it behind. The town where the coach stopped was smaller than she had expected, and quieter than she was prepared for. It sat in the open land like something that had been set down and not quite finished. The buildings spaced with gaps between them that suggested either optimism about future construction or a simple acceptance that this was all there would ever be. The afternoon light fell at a low angle across the main street and made everything look briefly golden. the way late light does, giving temporary beauty to things that will look ordinary again by morning. The postmaster's office doubled as the receiving station for the coach line. A man named Wade, compact and whiskered and possessed of the careful stillness of someone who had spent many years watching other people's business without commenting on it, came out to meet the arriving passengers. He looked at Wren with the particular expression of a small town that has been waiting for information and is now receiving it. She did not wait for him to speak first. "I'm looking for a letter from Roland Vess," she said. "Or a message. He said someone here would know how to direct me." Wade's expression shifted in a way she could not entirely read. Not unfriendly, but aware of something. "There's a message," he said. He went inside and came back with a folded piece of paper. She opened it there on the step, in the late afternoon light, with the dust of 3 days' travel still on her coat. "Foal is coming early. Couldn't leave. Follow the main road west until the stone gate with the iron V. Can't miss it. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Below that, a second line in writing that looked slightly different from the first, as though added after a pause. "I am glad you came." She read both lines. Then she folded the paper and put it in her pocket with the first letter. "Can you point me toward the road?" she asked Wade. He pointed. She thanked him, picked up both bags, and walked. She had gone perhaps 10 steps when Wade called after her. "Miss," he said, "Roland Vess hasn't had anyone out at that ranch in a long while." He paused, as though deciding how much of what he knew was his to give. "He's a particular kind of man. Takes getting used to." Wren turned to look at him. "So do I," she said. She turned back and kept walking. The road was exactly as described, straight and west and unmistakable, the land opening around it into distances she was still learning to trust. The stone gate appeared after perhaps 40 minutes of walking, the iron letter V worked into the arch above it with the plain craftsmanship of a person who had made it to last rather than to impress. The gate stood open. She walked through it. The ranch house came into view gradually, the way things do in open country, growing from a dark shape on the horizon into something definite and solid as she approached. It was not large, it was not pretty, but it had the quality of things that have been properly maintained, everything in its place, everything functioning, nothing wasted or neglected. The fence lines ran straight. The yard was swept. The outbuildings were weathered but sound. She heard him before she saw him. A low voice, steady and almost without inflection, coming from the barn to the left of the main house. She set her bags down by the front step and walked toward the sound. The barn doors stood open to the late afternoon air. Inside, in the amber-edged light that fell through the gaps in the upper boards, Roland Vess was kneeling in the straw beside a mare, one hand resting on the animal's neck with a steadiness that was unmistakably habitual. The posture of a man who had done this many times and knew how to make himself useful without making himself large. He was talking to the horse, not to her, not to himself in the way of self-conscious thinking aloud. To the horse, in the direct and matter-of-fact way of someone who finds conversation with animals no more peculiar than any other kind. He heard her step in the doorway and looked up. She had tried not to form a picture of him from the letter. Letters were poor materials for portraits, but she had formed one anyway, in the way the mind does against instruction, and what she found when she looked at him was both less and more than the picture she had made. He was older than she had imagined, though perhaps no older than she was herself. He had a face that had been out in weather for a long time, not ruined by it, only marked, the lines at the corners of his eyes deep and permanent. His hands, even in the brief glance she got before he moved, were the hands of a person who had worked with them for decades, rough-palmed and capable. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, not appraising her in the way of a man measuring a purchase, more like a man who has been told something significant and is letting the reality of it settle over the prior expectation. Then he stood, unhurrying, and came to the barn door. "You walked," he said. "The road was clear." He looked at her bags by the front step, then back at her. "I should have been there. You were here," she said. "The foal needed you here." Something in his face that had been slightly braced eased, very slightly, the way tension releases when a thing that was anticipated comes out differently than feared. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get your bags. I can manage them. I know you can." He moved past her toward the step. "But you've been walking." She watched him pick up both bags with the easy economy of a person for whom physical effort is so ordinary it requires no commentary. He carried them to the front door and held it open. She went in ahead of him. The house was plain and clean in the way she had not quite expected. She had braced herself for the interior of a man who had been living alone for a long time. The particular dimness of uncurtained windows, the accumulation of things placed down and not moved, the smell of a space that had been occupied but not tended. Instead, the rooms were orderly. Light came through windows that had been cleared. The floor showed signs of recent sweeping. There was nothing superfluous on any surface and nothing missing that was needed. He led her down a short hallway to a door at the end and pushed it open. The room was small. A bed, a nightstand, a chest of drawers with a wash basin on top. A window that looked out toward the eastern hills where the sky was beginning to think about evening. The curtains were not new exactly, but they were clean, and they had been recently ironed, the fold marks still visible. And there, on the door, a lock. New. She could see it plainly, the metal still bearing the faint brightness of something recently installed, the plate seated in wood that showed the pale marks of fresh cutting. It was not ornamental. It was not mentioned. It was simply there, as though it had always been there, as though the thought behind it were too ordinary to require explanation. She stood looking at it for a moment. "The key's on the nightstand," he said, from the doorway. He did not explain the lock. He did not wait for her to comment on it. He simply told her where the key was and then said, "Supper's at 7 if you want it. If you need to sleep instead, I'll leave something in the kitchen." "7 is fine," she said. He nodded once and left her there. She stood in the room for a moment after his footsteps faded down the hall. She looked at the key on the nightstand. Then she crossed to the door, turned the key in the lock, heard the bolt slide home, and stood for a moment with her hand still on the knob. When she was 13 years old, her father had told her that a person's character was most visible not in what they said, but in what they did when no one was looking. She had carried that with her the way children carry things their parents give them, not always consciously, but always. She stood in the locked room in the last of the afternoon light and thought about a man who had taken the time, before she arrived, to install a lock on a door in his own house. She took the ledger out of her bag and set it on the nightstand. She did not open it, but she set it there, where she could see it, and she unpacked her clothes into the chest of drawers, with the deliberate care of someone who intends to stay long enough to need drawers. She did not sleep before supper. She sat in the room in the quiet and listened to the sounds of the ranch through the walls, the distant movement of animals settling for the evening, the faint, persistent voice of the wind across the eaves, and once, briefly, the sound of footsteps in the hall that paused outside her door. Not a knock, just a pause, the weight of a person stopping without announcement, and then the footsteps continuing past, fading toward the other end of the house. She sat very still until the sound was gone. Then she got up, smoothed her dress, unlocked her door, and went to wash her hands before supper. He had made something simple: roasted meat, bread, a dish of preserved vegetables that tasted of summer put up against winter. Nothing elaborate, nothing intended to impress. He had set the table with the plain efficiency of a man for whom setting a table is a functional act rather than a social one. 2 places across from each other, everything needed and nothing extra. They sat down. He poured water from a pitcher. She broke the bread and passed half to him without thinking about it. He took it without comment. For a while they ate without speaking, and she found that the silence did not have the quality she had feared. It was not hostile. It was not awkward in the way silences are when 2 people both want to speak and neither knows how to begin. It was simply the silence of 2 people occupying the same space and not yet certain what shape the other one takes. He spoke first, eventually. Was the walk too long? No. Another silence. Then, Wade is a good man. He would have driven you out if you'd asked. I didn't need driving. He looked at her across the table. His eyes were a dark gray-green, the color of sage in poor light, and they had the quality of eyes that observe more than they reveal. No, he said. I don't suppose you did. She ate. He ate. Outside, the wind had settled into its evening register, lower and slower, moving across the land with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. She said after a while, "The foal, is it well?" Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the line of his jaw softened by a small degree. She's well. Small. But she's strong. Good. He looked at his plate, then back at her. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you arrived. You said that already. I know. He said it without embarrassment. I wanted to say it again. She met his eyes. I read your letter many times, she said. What you wrote was true. You're not good at letters. He accepted this without flinching. No. But what you meant came through. She looked back at her plate. That's not nothing. He did not respond to this immediately. When she looked up again, he was watching her with the careful attention of a man who has said something by accident and is deciding whether he meant it. She finished her supper. He cleared the plates. She told him it was a good meal. He said he wasn't much of a cook, which she doubted was entirely true because the bread had clearly been made that day and required some knowledge to come out as it had. She did not press the point. At the door of her room, she said good night. He said good night. She went in and locked the door and lay down on the bed in the dark and listened to the silence of a place she did not yet know. She was up before him. She had not meant to be, had not known what his habits were, but the wind had dropped in the small hours, and the sudden stillness woke her. The kind of quiet that arrives before dawn, complete and slightly expectant, as though the land is holding its breath before the day begins. She dressed in the dark, found the kitchen by memory, found the stove, and made coffee from what she found in the tin on the shelf near the window. She was standing at the kitchen table, both hands around her cup, looking at nothing in particular when she heard him in the hall. He came to the kitchen doorway and stopped. He was already dressed for work. He looked at her and then at the coffee. She poured a second cup and set it on the table. He came in, sat down, and picked it up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen held the pale early light and the smell of the coffee and the quiet of two people who are just beginning to learn the edges of each other. Then Wren saw it. It was on the table at the far end, where the space narrowed toward the wall. A ledger book, larger than hers, well used, lying open to a page dense with figures. She had not noticed it last night. She looked at it now with the attention she brought to any arrangement of numbers, taking in the columns, the spacing, the notation style. She did not reach for it. She looked away after a moment, back at her coffee, but something had registered, something that did not fit. A gap in a column, a figure that did not carry correctly to the next line. Small, easy to miss if you were looking at the numbers as a record rather than as a system. She had not been looking for anything, but she had seen it anyway, in the way that people who have worked with figures for a long time see things in them that others walk past, the way a carpenter notices a bad join in a piece of work that anyone else would only see as a wall. She said nothing. She looked at her coffee and said nothing. Across the table, Roland Vess drank his coffee in the early morning quiet, looking out the window toward the barn where the new foal was sleeping in the straw, and did not notice that the woman sitting across from him had already begun to pay a very particular kind of attention. She found the room as she had left it when she returned that morning, the key on the nightstand, the ledger still unopened on the surface beside it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them for a moment. Then she reached for the ledger and opened it to the first page. She took the pen from the nightstand drawer and wrote, in the clear, unhurried hand of a person who had spent years making records, 2 words at the top of the page: Wren Calloway. She looked at the name. Then she capped the pen, closed the ledger, and placed it back on the nightstand. Outside, she heard him moving toward the barn. The sound of the gate, the soft answer of the animals to his approach, the low, steady voice he used with them, patient and unhurried and without performance. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened. She did not know yet what the figures in his ledger meant. She did not know yet what the address on the sealed envelope would tell her, or what kind of man wrote to an address he never explained, or what was underneath the careful order of this place that had been waiting, she was beginning to feel, for someone who knew how to look at things closely. She knew only what she had established so far. A new lock on a door, a cup of coffee made before she was asked, a letter that had said, "I will not lie to you," and then, as far as she could tell, had not. For a woman who had arrived with very little, these were not small things. She rose from the bed, smoothed her dress, and went to find something useful to do. The first week passed in the way that first weeks in unfamiliar places tend to pass, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of time that is being paid careful attention to. Every morning the light came in thin and cold before she was ready for it, and every morning she rose anyway, dressed in the quiet, and went to the kitchen. Every morning the coffee tin was where she had found it on the first day. Every morning she made 2 cups. He did not ask her to do this. She did not announce that she would. It simply became the first of the small understandings they arrived at without discussion. The way people who are learning to share a space negotiate its terms not through language, but through repetition and adjustment, and the gradual accumulation of mornings. He was outside by the time she arrived in the kitchen. She had never caught him sleeping. She was beginning to suspect he did not sleep much, or that he slept in the hours she could not account for. The deep middle of the night when the ranch was so still that the silence had weight and density and was interrupted only by the wind. She learned the shape of his days by sound, the gate at first light, the low voice in the barn, the particular rhythm of the hammer when something needed mending, steady and even, neither hurried nor slow, the sound of the well handle in the late morning, the creak of the porch step when he came in for the midday meal, which he ate standing at the counter unless she had already set the table, in which case he sat without comment and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who regards food primarily as fuel and has no strong opinions about where he consumes it. He was not unfriendly, but friendliness, she was learning, was not a category that applied to him in any useful way. He occupied a different register, not warm, not cold, but present in the way that solid things are present, without effort and without apology. When he spoke, the words were useful. When he did not speak, the silence was not an absence of communication so much as a different form of it. She was, she realized by the fourth day, not uncomfortable. This surprised her. She had been uncomfortable for so long in so many places that she had begun to mistake the feeling for her own nature. On the fifth morning, she was carrying water from the well to the kitchen garden when the horse came. She heard it before she saw it. Hoofbeats on the main road, moving with the purposeful speed of a rider who knows where they are going and intends to arrive. She set her bucket down and straightened. The rider came through the gate without pausing, which told her something, and pulled up in the yard with the practiced ease of a man who had been here before, which told her more. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had arranged itself over the years into an expression of permanent pleasantness that did not reach the eyes. He was well dressed for this country, not elaborately, but deliberately. The kind of dress that announces comfort without advertising it. He looked at Wren with a brief, comprehensive assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating things quickly, and then he smiled. "You must be the new Mrs. Vess," he said, in the tone of a person delivering good news. "I must be," she said, which was true enough. He swung down from the horse with the smooth dismount of an experienced rider and extended his hand. "Decker Pratt, old family friend." He said the last two words with the practiced lightness of someone who had said them many times and found them useful. She shook his hand. His grip was exactly as firm as it needed to be, and not a fraction more. She noticed this. "Is Roland about?" he asked. "Southfield," she said. "I can send someone to find him." "No need, no need." He was already looking past her at the house, at the barn, at the property in general, with the particular quality of attention that is not admiration but inventory. "I'll wait. We have some business to discuss. Nothing urgent. Family matters." He smiled again. "You know how it is." She did not know how it was. She also did not believe that nothing was urgent. But she smiled pleasantly and offered him water and showed him to the porch and left him there. She found Roland at the south fence line, working a post that had been loosened by the recent dry spell, the ground cracking away from the base. She came across the field at a pace that was not running but was not leisurely either, and when he looked up at her approach, she saw him read something in the set of her shoulders before she spoke. "There's a man on the porch," she said. "Decker Pratt. He says family business." The change in Roland's face was brief and would have been easy to miss. It was not fear exactly. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for something unpleasant and has just been informed that the waiting is over. He set the post driver down carefully and picked up his jacket from the fence post where he draped it. "How long has he been there?" he asked. 10 minutes. He nodded once and started for the house. She walked beside him. After a moment, he said, without looking at her, "Decker Pratt is Eleanor's brother." She waited. He did not offer more immediately. She did not ask. Then he said, "Eleanor is my wife." The land went on around them, dry and open and entirely indifferent to the weight of those 4 words. She kept walking at the same pace. "I see," she said. "She left 3 years ago." His voice was the same as it always was, measured without ornamentation. "I haven't told anyone here. People assumed." Another pause. "I let them." She looked straight ahead at the house, at the figure of Decker Pratt visible on the porch, leaning against the rail with the comfortable posture of a man who owns time. "All right," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was watching her with that gray-green attention, looking for something. Not permission exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that told him whether the ground ahead was going to hold. "That's all you're going to say?" he asked. "Not forever," she said, "but for now." She looked toward the porch. "We shouldn't keep him waiting." Decker Pratt delivered his news with the polish of a man who had rehearsed it, or who had delivered similar news often enough that rehearsal was no longer necessary. Eleanor's father, Wren corrected herself internally, understanding now the distinction, had passed some weeks prior. His estate included a provision, 1/2 of Vess Ranch, held in Eleanor's name, to be administered by her legal representative in the event of her absence. Decker was the legal representative. He had documentation. He was very sorry for any inconvenience. He was sure they could come to an arrangement that suited everyone. He had 6 weeks, professionally speaking, but he was in no hurry. Roland listened to all of this from the chair across the porch table, with a stillness that was not calm so much as the absence of any expression he was willing to let Decker see. When Decker finished, he said, "I'll need to look at the documentation." "Of course," Decker said warmly. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He handed over a folded sheaf of papers with the ease of a man who has already made copies of everything. Wren sat slightly to the side, which Decker had arranged by taking the chair that would have placed her in the center of the conversation. She noted this. She also noted the way he had positioned his horse so that it blocked the clearest view of the gate from the porch. A small thing, possibly meaningless, possibly not. When Decker rode out 20 minutes later, she watched him go with the attention she usually reserved for columns of figures that did not quite add up. Roland stood at the porch rail with the documents in his hand and did not speak for a long moment. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm telling you now." "I know." She looked at the road where Decker's horse had gone. "Is there more?" He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to answer her question before he spoke. "I've been sending Eleanor money," he said, "since she left, every month." Wren looked at him. He was still watching the road. "Why?" she asked. He took a long time with this. "Because I didn't know what else to do," he said finally. "Because doing nothing felt worse." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite asking for forgiveness, and not quite expecting it either. Something rawer than either. The expression of a man reporting a fact about himself that he has not previously had to say aloud. It was not a wise thing to do. No, she agreed. It wasn't. She looked at the papers in his hand. Can I see those? He handed them over without hesitation. She sat down in the chair Decker had vacated and began to read. She read for a long time. He went to check on the foal and came back, and she was still reading, or reading again, moving through the same pages, with the focused return of someone who has found something and is tracing it back to be certain. He sat on the porch step and waited. The notarization on this document, she said eventually, without looking up, is dated after the death notice. He was quiet. The father's signature, she continued. It's here, on the amendment to the original estate arrangement. But if the death notice is accurate about the timing, this amendment was processed afterward. She set the papers on her knee and looked up. That's not possible, is it? Roland looked at the papers. No, he said slowly. It's not. She handed them back. I could be wrong about the dates, she said. I'd want to look more carefully. Compare the notice with the processing records. She paused. If I'm right, this document may not be what it's being presented as. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly. More like the expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just had someone offer to take one end. How do you know how to read these? He asked. I kept books for a shipping company for 11 years, she said. You learn to read documents, all kinds. She looked out at the yard. You learn that paper can be made to say things, and that the way to find the truth is to look at whether the numbers, or the dates, or the sequence are consistent with each other. And these aren't. I'm not certain yet, she said carefully. I want to be certain before I say more. He nodded. He folded the papers and held them for a moment, looking at them. Then he held them out to her. Keep them, he said. Look as long as you need. She looked at the ranch ledger that night. She had not planned to. She had carried Decker's documents to her room and spread them on the small desk, working through the dates and sequences again by lamplight. And when she finally sat back from them, she found that her mind had returned, as it had been returning for several days, to the figures she had glimpsed on that first morning at the kitchen table. She went quietly to the kitchen. The ledger was where it always was, at the far end of the table. She stood over it without touching it for a moment, as though asking its permission, which was not something she would have admitted to doing if asked. Then she sat down and opened it. She did not read it as a personal document. She read it as a professional one, moving through the figures with the systematic attention she had once applied to manifests and invoices and accounts receivable, looking not for meaning, but for pattern. Numbers had patterns the way land had patterns, and the breaks in the pattern were where the information lived. She found the first break in 20 minutes. It was not dramatic. It would not have been visible to anyone who was not looking for it, or who did not have the specific training to recognize what the irregularity indicated. A series of payments, recorded in a consistent hand, that appeared in the ledger under a category labeled simply Services Rendered. Not unusual in itself. What was unusual was the timing. The payments appeared at intervals that did not correspond to any of the other operational rhythms of the ranch, not seasonal, not tied to purchase cycles, not aligned with the hired hand payments that appeared elsewhere in the book. They were, she realized as she traced them back through the months, almost precisely regular. Not quite regular enough to look like a fixed arrangement, but more regular than chance. She sat with this for a long time. Then she closed the ledger carefully, replaced it exactly as she had found it, and went back to her room. She did not sleep for a while. She lay in the dark and thought about patterns and about the address on the sealed envelope she had seen on Roland's desk in the first days, which she had memorized without intending to, the way she memorized things without intending to, the way numbers arranged themselves in her mind whether she asked them to or not. The writing lesson happened on the 8th day, or what she thought of as the writing lesson, though he never called it that. He had asked her the evening before whether she had ridden before. She had said, honestly, that she had ridden as a girl, but not for many years, and not in country like this. He had said, with the economy she was becoming accustomed to, that she would need to. The ranch required it. He brought out a horse called Marsh, a gray mare with a calm eye and the settled patience of an animal that has spent a long time being trustworthy and knows it. He showed Wren the tack without commentary, going through each piece with the unhurried precision of a man who sees no distinction between important and unimportant knowledge. She paid attention. She always paid attention. When she mounted, he came to stand at the horse's left shoulder, which put him close, closer than they had been since she arrived. She was aware of this, without making anything of it. He adjusted her hands on the reins, not by taking her hands, but by placing his own briefly over them, correcting the angle, and then moving away. His hands were warm and rough-palmed, the touch impersonal and entirely focused on its purpose. "Heels down," he said. She moved her heels down. "Don't hold your breath." She let her breath out. They went around the yard at a walk, then a slow trot, then back to a walk. He walked alongside without speaking, unless there was something to correct, and there was less and less to correct as the session went on, because she learned quickly and always had. He noticed this. She could tell from the changed texture of his silence, which ran quieter and somehow more attentive when he was watching something that surprised him. After an hour, he told her that was enough for the first day. She dismounted and stroked the mare's nose and thanked him. "Thank Marsh," he said. "She's patient." "She is," Wren agreed. "So are you." He looked at her briefly. Then he took the mare's bridle and led her toward the barn and said nothing more. The letter came on the 12th day from the address she had memorized. She had written to it 6 days earlier, not using her own name. She had written as an inquiry regarding a mutual acquaintance, a ruse that required some care, but that she had managed. She had kept the letter brief. She had asked only whether a woman named Eleanor currently resided at that address, and whether Eleanor was well, and whether she had any message she wished conveyed. The reply was written in a hand that was slightly unsteady, as though the writer had been uncertain while writing, or was not often in the habit of writing letters of any kind. "Yes," it said, "she is here. She is not well exactly, but she is not ill. She asked me to write this down for her. She did not know her brother was pursuing the estate matter. She says she did not ask him to. She says, please be careful. She says she is sorry, though she did not say for what. And she says, the signature on any document from the last several months of her father's life may not be what it appears to be. She will not say more in a letter, but she would speak to someone in person if they came." Wren read this twice. Then she folded it and sat with it in her hands for a long time. in the room with the new lock on the door and the ledger on the nightstand, in the quiet of a house she had not yet decided how to think of. She had not told Roland she was writing. She had not told him what she suspected about the ledger payments. She had not told him about the address she had memorized. She was not ready to tell him any of it, not because she did not trust him, or not exactly, but because she had learned by long and expensive experience that information shared before it is complete is information that can be taken and misused, and she was not yet done gathering it. She was also, if she was honest with herself in the way she tried always to be, not certain what she was going to do with it when she had it. She had arrived 12 days ago with 2 bags and a ledger book and a letter she had read too many times. She had no claim to anything here except the room with the lock and the tentative, unspoken arrangement of 2 cups of coffee every morning. She put the letter in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, against her ribs, where she could feel it when she breathed. Then she heard the footsteps in the yard, heavy, familiar, the particular rhythm of a man returning from the south field. And she straightened and smoothed her dress and went to start supper, because supper needed starting, and there were things she needed to think through before she could say any of them aloud. That evening, she looked up from her plate and found Roland watching her. Not with suspicion, with the careful, unhurried attention he turned on things he was trying to understand. She had seen him look at the foal that way, and at a section of fence that had been giving him trouble, and once, briefly, at a piece of machinery in the barn that had stopped working and then inexplicably started again. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm often quiet." "Different quiet," he said. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she saw in his expression that he knew it too. He did not press. He returned to his plate with the patience of a man who has decided that some things arrive in their own time, and pushing them only delays them further. "I need to take a trip," she said. He looked up. "Not far," she said. "2 days there and back. There's something I need to look into." She met his eyes. "I'll tell you what I find when I come back. I'm not ready to say more than that yet." He studied her for a moment. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadow, unreadable in the way of faces that do not perform their emotions. "All right," he said. "You're not going to ask me where. If you wanted me to know where, you'd have told me." She looked at him across the table in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning between them. Something in her chest did an unfamiliar thing, a kind of settling, as though a piece of machinery that had been running slightly off balance had found its proper alignment. "I should be back by Thursday," she said. He nodded and poured more coffee into her cup, and then into his own, and they finished supper in the quiet of 2 people who have just said something significant in the space between ordinary sentences and are letting it be what it is. She was in her room, packing a small bag for the trip, when she heard it. She had almost missed it, almost dismissed it as the wind, or the settling of the house, or any of the sounds that a structure makes at night when the temperature drops and the wood contracts and the small complaints of the building become briefly audible. But this was not the house settling. This was a footstep, one and then another, in the hall, coming from the direction of the main room, stopping outside her door. She stood very still with the folded blouse in her hands and listened. The pause lasted perhaps 15 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, long enough for whoever stood there to have thought of knocking and decided against it, or to have come with a purpose and then changed their mind, or simply to be standing in the dark outside her door for reasons she could not know. Then the footsteps moved on, quietly, back toward the other end of the house. She stood still for another moment. Then she finished packing, set the bag by the door, and lay down on the bed without undressing. She looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about footsteps that stopped and did not knock, and locks that were installed before a person arrived, and letters that said, "I will not lie to you," and what it meant that she was already, without having planned to, thinking of this place as somewhere she intended to return to. Thursday, she had said. She would be back by Thursday. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence and let Thursday feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like something she was moving toward rather than something to endure. She came back on a Wednesday. Not Thursday, as she had said, but Wednesday, arriving at the gate in the late afternoon light with a small bag over her shoulder and the look of a person who has found what they were looking for and is still deciding what to do with it. The sky behind her was the particular amber of late autumn afternoons in open country, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, edges sharpened, colors deepened, the world briefly and beautifully overstated. Roland was at the well when she came through the gate. He looked up and she saw him register the day, Wednesday, not Thursday, and then set the register aside without comment. He set down the bucket and walked toward her, and took the bag from her shoulder without asking and carried it inside. She followed him into the kitchen. He poured water into a cup and set it in front of her. She drank. He sat down across the table and waited with the patience she had come to think of as one of his essential qualities, the way some people are defined by their restlessness and others by their humor. And Roland Vess was defined, more than anything, by his willingness to wait. She set the cup down and looked at him. "I went to see Eleanor," she said. He was very still. "She didn't ask me to come," Wren continued. "She didn't know I was coming. But she agreed to see me once I arrived." She folded her hands on the table. "She's not well, but she's not ill. She's frightened. Of Decker." She watched his face move through something she could not fully name. Not surprise. She did not think much surprised him. Something older than surprise, something that had been waiting to be confirmed and was now receiving its confirmation, and did not know yet whether that was a relief or a wound. "Did she know about the estate claim?" Wren asked. "No." The word came out flat and certain. "She didn't." "She told me the same. She said Decker acted without her knowledge. She said her father's mind was not his own in the last months. That Decker kept people away, managed his affairs." She looked at Roland steadily. "She believes the documents Decker brought here were signed under circumstances her father would not have chosen for himself if he had been able to choose." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard with its habitual patience. "Can she prove that?" Roland asked. "Not alone," Wren said. "But I can." She showed him the ledger first. She had returned it to the kitchen table before her trip, and she went to it now and opened it to the pages she had marked in her memory, no physical markers needed, and laid out what she had found. She did not dramatize it. She simply showed him the pattern as she would have shown a colleague an anomaly in a set of accounts. "Here and here and here. Do you see the interval? Do you see the category? Do you see the name that appears, and then is obscured by the notation? But if you look at the handwriting, you can see it is the same hand across all of them." He looked where she pointed. His jaw tightened by a degree. "Casper," he said, The name of his youngest hired hand, she understood, before she had to ask. "I think so," she said carefully. "The writing is consistent, and the amounts correspond to what someone would need to pay a debt regularly over time, not what someone would charge for irregular services." He stood with his hands flat on the table, looking at the figures, and she let him look without filling the silence. "Casper's been with me 4 years," he said. "I know. He's not a bad person." "I don't think he is either," she said. "I think he owes Decker money, and Decker found a use for that." She paused. "I haven't spoken to him. I wanted to speak to you first." He looked up from the ledger and met her eyes, and in his expression she saw something that was not yet gratitude, but was in the territory of it, something that acknowledged, without performance, that she had done something significant in the way she had done it, carefully, and in the right order, and with his dignity intact. "And the documents?" he asked. She went to her room and brought back Decker's papers and the notes she had made on her trip, organized in the ledger she had begun keeping of her own. She spread them out and walked him through the sequence of dates, the processing record she had managed to verify during her 2 days away, the inconsistency between the official death record and the amendment's registered date. "There's a gap," she said. 6 days between the recorded death and the notarization of this amendment. The amendment required his signature. She looked at him. 6 days is not possible." Roland straightened. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving over the papers without reading them, his mind clearly somewhere beyond what was in front of him. "Decker would have known the timing," he said. "He was there." "Yes." "He would have needed someone to witness the signature, a notary who would look the other way, or who didn't look closely enough." He exhaled slowly. "Or who owed him something." "That's what I think," she said. "I can't prove the last part yet, but I can prove the date inconsistency. That alone should be enough to challenge the document." He looked at her across the spread of papers, and she looked back at him, and for a moment the kitchen was just 2 people standing on either side of a table with the evidence of someone's dishonesty between them, and the particular shared understanding of people who have been separately wronged by the same carelessness and are only now discovering this about each other. "When did you start looking into this?" he asked. "The first morning," she said. "I saw the ledger on the table. I wasn't looking for anything, but once I saw the numbers, I couldn't stop seeing them." She met his eyes. "I should have told you sooner." "You didn't know me sooner," he said. "It was not an absolution. It was simply accurate." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." He found Casper the next morning. Wren did not go with him. She stayed in the kitchen and worked through her own notes and listened to the sound of the barn and the yard and the long pauses that happen when a conversation requires more courage than most conversations do. When Roland came back inside 40 minutes later, his face was composed, but the set of his shoulders carried something heavier than when he had left. He sat down at the table. "He's been sending Decker reports," Roland said. "What the ranch takes in, what we spend, when I'm away from the property." He looked at his hands. "Decker has been building a picture of the operation for months, knowing the finances, knowing the weak points. Is Casper willing to say so?" "He'll write it down," Roland said. "He wants to. He's been wanting to for a while." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not a bad person." "I know," she said again, because it bore saying again. He looked up at her. "You said that before, because you needed to hear it twice." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She was learning to read the gradations of his expressions, which were small but not meaningless or uniform. This one was the expression he had when she had said something that landed in a way he had not expected, and he was adjusting. "What do we do with what Casper gives us?" he asked. "We take it to the hearing," she said, "along with the date inconsistency. Together, they make a picture that is very difficult to argue with." She paused. "Decker brought this as a legal matter. We answer it the same way." Roland looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "Not exactly this," she said honestly. "But I've spent a great deal of time learning the difference between what documents say and what they mean. And I've spent a great deal of time learning that the truth is usually in the numbers, if you know where to look." He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind came up briefly, and then settled. Morning light moved across the kitchen floor in the unhurried way of light that has nowhere to be. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The night before you came back," he said, "I went to your door." He was looking at his hands again. Then he looked up, and the directness of his gaze had the quality of something that costs something. "I didn't knock. I wasn't sure what I would have said." He paused. "I wanted to know you were going to come back." The kitchen was very quiet. "I came back early," she said. "I know. That's the answer to the question you didn't knock to ask." He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his. And in the space between them, something shifted by a small degree. So small, it would have been invisible to anyone watching, and yet large enough that both of them felt it, and neither of them looked away. That evening, she found him sitting on the porch in the dark, not on the chair, but on the step, which was lower and less formal. The posture of a person who has come outside not to sit on a porch, but to sit with something they cannot quite contain inside four walls. She brought her coat and sat beside him without asking whether he wanted company. He did not move to give her more room or less. He simply accommodated her presence in the way of a person who has accepted that she is here and finds the acceptance uncomplicated. They sat without speaking for a while. The sky above the open land was enormous in the way that skies in open country always are, too large for the eyes to fully take in, the stars so numerous they gave the dark a texture. She had not seen a sky like this since she was a child. In the years before, she had been given to understanding that there were things a person was supposed to want more than a clear view of the sky at night. "I owe you an explanation," Roland said. "You don't," she said, "but I'll listen if you want to give one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he began, not with the day Eleanor left, which she might have expected, but further back. He spoke about the years before, about the particular quality of a marriage that is not wrong, but is not right. Two people in the same house moving around each other in patterns that work well enough, but never quite arrive at ease. He spoke about this without bitterness, and without the false fairness of a man who has decided to distribute blame evenly for the sake of his own conscience. He spoke about it the way he spoke about most things, plainly, looking for accuracy rather than sympathy. "I thought it would get better," he said. "I thought if I worked hard enough and didn't ask for things I didn't have and made the ranch into something worth staying for, that she would." He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He looked out at the dark instead. "She needed things I didn't know how to give. I understood that better after she left than I did before." Wren looked at the sky. A long time passed. The man I was supposed to marry, she said, told 300 people that I could not give him children. He said it at the door of the church, in front of everyone, before I had said a word. She said this without trembling, in the same quiet, factual register she had used for other difficult things, because she had decided a long time ago that the facts of her life did not have power over her unless she allowed them the theatrical treatment, the dramatization that made them larger than they were. I had known for 2 years. I had told him. He had said it didn't matter. She paused. It mattered. Roland did not say he was sorry. She was glad. The words people said when they were sorry for things they had not done were well-meaning and nearly always insufficient, and she had received enough of them to know that they left no residue of comfort. What he said was, he said it in front of people. Yes. He chose to, Roland said. Not a question. A recognition of the specific cruelty of it, the deliberate public nature of it, which was different in kind from simply ending an engagement and required its own acknowledgement. Yes, she said again. He looked at the sky for a while. What did you do? I walked home, she said. I made tea. I sat in my rented room, and I did not cry, because I thought if I cried, I would be giving him something. She paused. I regret that. Not the leaving, not the not crying in public, but the not crying alone. I think I owed myself that, and I didn't pay it. The night was very still. Something moved in the grass somewhere beyond the fence, small and secret, and going about its own business entirely. I cried once, Roland said, after Eleanor left. I was in the south field, and I sat down in the grass like a fool, and he stopped, started again. It didn't feel like grief exactly. It felt like shame, which I understand now is not the same thing at all. And the shame was mine, but the grief, some of the grief, belonged to something real. She looked at him. He was looking at the dark, his profile still and angular in the faint light from the house behind them. You're not a fool, she said. I know that now, he said. It took a while. A long silence settled between them. Not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the other kind. The silence that means the things that have been said are still moving through the air, finding their places, being absorbed. His hand was on the step between them. She did not take it. She simply moved her own hand to the step, close enough that the sides of them were nearly touching, and felt the warmth of him through the narrow space of air that remained. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The stars turned very slowly overhead, as they always do, indifferent and faithful. 3 days later, he said, You were right about Casper. She was at the kitchen table with a ledger and looked up. He was in the doorway, hat in hand, and his expression carried news. He talked, she said. He talked. He came inside and sat across from her. More than I expected. Decker approached him 14 months ago. He knew about the debt. Casper couldn't figure out how, but Decker knew. The arrangement was information for debt relief, and Casper understood by the end that the debt was never going to be fully relieved, that Decker would keep finding ways to extend it. He set his hat on the table. He's written it all down, dated with specific conversations. Good, she said. That's very good. There's more. He looked at her steadily. Casper said Decker told him, some months ago, that the ranch would be Decker's by the turn of the season, that Roland Vess would not be in a position to resist. He paused. He told Casper to start looking for other work. Wren set her pen down carefully. He was confident, she said. Completely. She thought about this, about the particular confidence of a person who has arranged all the pieces in advance, who has surveyed the field from a high point before entering it, who has made provision for every resistance and believes there is no counter that has not already been accounted for. He didn't account for me, she said. The words came out without theatrical weight, simply as an observation, accurate and unembellished. Roland looked at her across the table, and what was in his face this time was not the gratitude-adjacent expression she had seen before. It was something more direct than that, something that recognized her, not the usefulness of her skills, not the value of what she had found, but her, the whole and particular person who had walked through his gate with 2 bags and a ledger, and the decision not to be easily moved. No, he said. He didn't. She picked up her pen and returned to the ledger. After a moment, she heard him pull his chair closer to the table. "Can I help?" he asked. She looked at him. In 4 weeks, she had not heard him ask this about anything indoors, anything that was not a physical task he could see a direct role in. She looked at him for a moment, reading the question. "Can you write a clear account of your ranch's finances for the past 2 years?" she asked. "Your side of the ledger, in your own words. Not for me, for the hearing. So that there is a version of the numbers that comes from you." "Yes," he said. He said it without hesitation, which told her that the hesitation she might have expected. The pride of a man reluctant to show the particulars of his struggle was not going to be the obstacle she had sometimes feared. She tore a clean page from the back of her own ledger and slid it across to him, and then slid a pen after it, and he took both and bent over the page and began to write, and for a while the only sound in the kitchen was the scratch of 2 pens moving through the same silence. That night she was at her desk when the knock came. Not the presence without sound she had grown accustomed to. A knock, 2 of them, deliberate, and then his voice. "Wren." She went to the door and opened it. He stood in the hallway with something in his hand, a small thing, something she couldn't immediately identify in the low light. He held it out. It was a key, not the key she already had. The one to the lock he had installed before she arrived. A different key. Older, more worn. She took it and turned it in her fingers. "That's the house key," he said. "The main door." He was looking at her in the way he looked at things he was not sure about, but had decided to do anyway. The look of a man acting ahead of his certainty. "You should have one." She looked at the key in her palm. She thought about what a key meant, practically, in a house like this, in a life like the one this place required. It meant nothing was locked against her. It meant she could come and go in the dark hours without waiting for him. It meant the house acknowledged her in a way that the room alone did not. "You installed my lock before I arrived," she said. "Yes." "And now you're giving me the house key." He did not answer in words. He reached out and set the key more firmly in her palm, pressing it there gently, the way a person seals something they mean to be kept, and then stepped back. The hallway was dim and warm and smelled of lamp oil and the faint cedar of the walls, and the house settled around them in its ordinary way, the small sounds of a structure at rest, unbothered and continuing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "I'm glad you came early," he said. "On Wednesday." "So am I," she said. He went down the hall. She stood in the doorway of her room with a key in each hand, the new one and the old one, and looked at both of them in the low light. Then she went inside and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the ledger to the first page, where her name was written in her own hand, and she looked at it for a moment, the way she had looked at it on the first day. Then she turned to the next page, and the next, all the careful work she had done in the week since arriving, and she felt, with the quiet certainty of something that has arrived without announcement, that this was not the record of her time in a stranger's house. This was the beginning of something else entirely. She closed the ledger. She put both keys on the nightstand side by side. She lay down in the dark and listened to the house, which sounded, tonight, like a place that knew she was in it. She came before dawn. Wren heard the horse first, a single rider, moving fast and then slowing as the gate came into view, the animal's breathing audible in the deep quiet of the pre-dawn dark. She was already half awake, as she often was in the early hours, lying in that particular state of suspended alertness that had become habitual since arriving at the ranch, her mind running its quiet accounting even in sleep. The sound of an arriving horse at that hour was not ordinary, and ordinary was the standard she had learned to measure everything against. She was dressed and at the window before the rider reached the yard. The figure that dismounted was not large. In the thin gray light that preceded the sun, before color had returned to anything, Wren could see only the general shape of a woman. Slight, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body has been tense for a long time and has forgotten how to be otherwise. The horse was lathered. It had been ridden hard for a while. Wren took the house key from the nightstand and went to the front door. She opened it before the woman knocked. Eleanor Vess. She still bore the name, legally, and something about seeing her in person made the fact of it more concrete than it had been in correspondence or in Roland's careful, halting accounts. Was older than Wren had expected, though not old. She had the look of a person who had been pretty once and was still pretty, but in the way of things that have been under significant weather, the beauty rearranged rather than lost. Her eyes, when they found Wren's in the thin light, were exhausted and frightened and something else, determined perhaps, in the way that people are determined when they have finally decided to do something they have been avoiding for a long time. "I'm sorry for the hour," Eleanor said. "Come in," Wren said. She brought her inside and sat her at the kitchen table and built up the fire and put water on without speaking. Eleanor sat with her hands wrapped around nothing, watching Wren move through the kitchen with the look of someone observing a domestic competence they have spent years trying to achieve and never quite managed. "Decker knows I've been in contact with you," Eleanor said, when Wren set a cup in front of her. "I don't know how. I was careful. But he knows. When did you realize?" 3 days ago. He came to where I was staying. He didn't threaten me directly. He's never direct." Her mouth thinned. "He said he was worried about me. He said he thought I was confused about what was best for me. He said I should come home with him, that he would take care of everything." She looked at the cup. "He's been taking care of everything for 20 years. That's the problem." Wren heard Roland in the hallway before she saw him, the quiet footfall of a man who moves carefully in the dark out of long habit rather than stealth. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. Eleanor looked up. The two of them looked at each other across the kitchen, and what passed between them was not the charged air of former intimacy or the cold weather of old resentment, It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. The look of two people who had spent years in proximity to each other's pain without ever finding a way to speak about it directly, and who were doing so now under conditions that made every previous evasion visible. "Eleanor," he said. "Roland," she said. "I'm sorry to come like this." "Don't be." He came to the table and sat down at the end, equidistant from both of them, which struck Wren as instinctive rather than calculated. He poured himself water from the pitcher and looked at Eleanor with the steady attention he brought to difficult things. "Tell me what he said," Roland said. She told him. It took a while because Eleanor spoke in the way of someone who has organized her thoughts into order but keeps finding that the telling requires more of her than the thinking did, pausing, backtracking, correcting herself, working toward an accuracy she clearly felt she owed both of them even when it cost her. Wren listened and did not interrupt. Roland listened in the same way. When Eleanor finished, there was a silence that was not emptiness, but density. Too much present in it to be comfortable, not enough resolved to be bearable. "He's not going to stop," Eleanor said. "I know him better than anyone. When he has decided he wants something, She stopped. "He finds the thing a person cannot afford to lose, and he holds it over them. With Casper, it was money. With me, it was—" She paused again, and this pause was different from the others, deeper. "He has letters, from when I left. Things I wrote, in the first months, when I was not in a good state of mind. Things I said about Roland that were not fair and not true, but that would look damaging if they were shown to the right people at the right time." Roland did not react visibly. He looked at the table. "He would use those," Eleanor said. "At the hearing, if we challenge the document. He would introduce them as evidence of— I don't know exactly how he would frame it. He's inventive." She looked at Roland. "I wanted you to know before it happened, so it didn't surprise you." "Thank you," Roland said. He said it without any discernible expression, which Wren had learned to read as the particular tone he used when an emotion was present and he was choosing not to perform it. Wren looked at her notes, at the careful architecture of dates and figures she had built over the past weeks. She thought about the letter Decker had produced, the document with the impossible date. She thought about Casper's written account, signed and waiting. She thought about the shape of what they had and what this new information added to it. And her mind did what it always did with information. It looked for the pattern, and within the pattern, the place where the thing was weakest. "The letters," she said. "Are they dated?" Eleanor looked at her. "Yes." "And they were written in the months immediately after you left?" "Yes, within the first season." Wren was quiet for a moment. "Then they post-date the estate document," she said. "By definition, anything written after you left cannot be used to characterize the state of the marriage during the period covered by the estate arrangement. If Decker tries to introduce them as evidence of Roland's character or fitness as a property owner during the period in question, the dates work against him, not for him." She looked at Eleanor. "A person familiar with legal documents would know this." Eleanor stared at her. "Decker isn't using them as a legal instrument," Wren continued. "He's using them as a threat. He expects the threat to be enough. He expects that the prospect of those letters being read publicly will be sufficient to make Roland step back from the challenge." She looked at Roland. "That's why he hasn't filed any additional claims or produced any supporting documentation. He's waiting for the threat to do the work so he doesn't have to." The kitchen was very still. He thinks the shame of it will stop you, Eleanor said slowly to Roland. He's used it before, Roland said. The words came out with a flatness that was not defeat, but recognition, the tone of a man identifying a pattern he had encountered without previously naming it. Not this specifically, but the shape of it. Wren closed her ledger and set her pen down with the care she gave to things she intended to pick up again. Then we don't give him the opportunity to deploy the threat, she said. We move before he expects us to. She had not told him about the marriage document yet. She had been holding it for the right moment, the way she held all information until she was certain she knew what it was for. And the right moment had not previously arrived in a form she trusted. Now, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning with Eleanor across from her and Roland at the end and the light beginning to come in through the window, she understood that the right moment was not a comfortable one. It was this one. There is something else, she said. Both of them looked at her. 3 weeks ago, she said, addressing Roland directly, I arranged for our marriage contract to be properly completed and filed. She said it simply, in the same register she used for fax. I had the paperwork prepared by a notary in town, and I signed where required. You had signed the original agreement before I arrived, so your signature was already present. It only needed completion and registration. Roland was very still. I did not tell you I was doing this, she said. I want to explain why. She held his gaze. When Decker arrived and I began to understand what he was attempting, I recognized that the incomplete status of our contract was a vulnerability he could exploit. He could argue, accurately at that point, that I had no formal standing here, that I was a person passing through rather than a party with legal interest in the property. She paused. I didn't know you well enough then to ask. I didn't know whether you would say yes. And I needed it done before the hearing was set, before Decker had time to identify the gap and move into it. The silence stretched. If you want me to undo it, she said, I will find a way. I know what I did was... She stopped herself. I know that decisions about your life should be made with your knowledge. I didn't give you that. I made a calculation and I acted on it, and I am telling you now because you deserve to know, and because I would rather you be angry with me than find out from someone else. Roland looked at her for a long time. His face moved through something she could not follow entirely. Too many things present at once, and she let it move without trying to intercept it. She had said what she had to say. The rest was not hers to manage. Eleanor, across the table, was watching them both with the expression of a person witnessing something that clarifies other things by contrast. When Roland spoke, his voice was even, and what was in it was not anger, or not primarily anger. You signed it before you knew how it would come out, he said. Yes. Before you knew if the challenge would succeed. Yes. So it wasn't... He stopped, started again. You weren't securing an interest in the property. If the hearing went wrong, you still would have had no more protection than before. No more protection, she agreed, but you would have had one more person with standing to stand beside you. She met his eyes. That's all I was trying to give you. Morning light lay across the table between them, warm and without ceremony. When did you decide? He said. When did you decide to do that? She looked at him. She thought about the answer with the honesty she tried to bring to things that mattered. The night you gave me the house key, she said. I lay in the dark with both keys on the nightstand, and I thought about what a person does when they have decided they are not leaving. She paused. That's when I decided. Decker arrived 2 hours later. He did not knock. He came through the gate on his horse and up to the porch and stood in the yard and called out, which was the behavior of a man who has decided the pleasantries are finished and the territory is already his. He was dressed as he always dressed, deliberately and without ostentation, and he wore the expression of a man who had calculated his advantage and found it sufficient. Wren saw him from the kitchen window before he announced himself. She watched him take in the second horse at the fence, Eleanor's lathered mare, resting now, and she saw the calculation happen in his face, swift and barely visible, the rapid reassessment of a man whose plan has met an unexpected variable. Roland went to the door. Wren came and stood beside him, to the left, not behind him in the way of a person taking shelter, to the left and slightly forward, in the way of a person who is also present. Decker looked at Roland, then at Wren, then past them both, into the kitchen, where Eleanor sat at the table with her hands around her cup, and did not look away when her brother's eyes found her. "This is a family matter," Decker said. His voice had shed its practiced warmth. What was underneath was not cold exactly, but functional, stripped of performance in the way of someone who has decided that the audience no longer requires managing. "Yes," Roland said, "it is. I'd like to speak to Eleanor." "Eleanor is choosing who she speaks to," Wren said. Decker looked at her. She had not previously spoken directly to him in any of their encounters, and the look he gave her now was the look of a man revising an assessment he had made too quickly. "You have no standing in this matter," he said, not aggressively. He said it the way he said everything, with the pleasant reasonableness of someone who believes their position is self-evident. "I have a filed marriage contract," Wren said, "which gives me standing as a party with legal interest in this property. I also have a ledger documenting 14 months of payments from your agent to my husband's employee in exchange for information about this ranch's operations. And I have records that establish a date inconsistency in the document you presented." She let these things settle for a moment in the morning air. "I have quite a bit of standing." The pleasantness left Decker's face. It did not leave violently. It departed the way things depart from the faces of people who do not permit themselves expressions of anger. By degrees, the features returning to something flatter and more honest. He looked at her with the eyes of a man encountering an obstacle he had not mapped. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," she said. "Those letters," he said, looking at Roland now. "The things Eleanor wrote. I have them in town. I can have them at the hearing. Whatever advantage you think your wife's bookkeeping gives you, consider whether you want those letters read in public." Roland did not answer immediately. Wren put her hand on his arm, not holding him back, simply present, a point of contact. "The letters are dated after the estate document was executed," Wren said. "They establish nothing about the period in question. Any advocate worth their fee will explain this to the panel before you finish your introduction." She looked at Decker steadily. "But I think you know that. I think you always knew that. I think those letters were never a legal instrument. They were an embarrassment you were holding over Roland in the hope that the threat of embarrassment would be sufficient to make this easy for you." Decker was very still. "It isn't going to be easy," she said. A long pause. In the yard behind Decker, a bird landed on the fence post and departed again, uninterested in any of it. "I'll see you at the hearing," Decker said. His voice was flat now, all the register gone out of it, the voice of a man who has reassigned his resources and is already thinking about the next move. He turned and mounted his horse and rode out through the gate. Wren stood at the door until the dust of his departure had settled. Then she let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it, and turned back into the house. Eleanor left that afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Decker's departure, past the midday meal, past the hour when the light shifted and the yard moved into the long gold of afternoon, and she spoke more in those hours than Wren suspected she had spoken in months. She spoke about her father and about the years she had watched Decker manage him, slowly and thoroughly, in the way that some people manage others. Not with force, but with patience, with the steady replacement of the managed person's own judgment with the manager's until the distinction between self and direction became impossible to identify. She spoke about leaving the ranch, which she did without melodrama or self-justification, simply as an account of a person who had reached the end of their endurance and made a decision that was not right and had known it was not right at the time, but had been incapable of knowing what the right thing was. She had wanted a different life, she said. She had wanted it badly enough to take it without thinking about the cost in the direction of others. "I am sorry," she said to Roland at one point, simply and without ceremony. "I know," he said. "I was unkind in those letters." "I know," he said again. "I didn't mean—" She stopped herself, reconsidered. "Some of it I meant at the time. I was not—" She looked at her hands. "I was not honest with myself for a long time about what the trouble between us was. It was easier to write it as your failure." Roland looked at her steadily. "We were not well suited," he said. "That's not a failure of either of us, particularly. Some things are true before the people involved understand them." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Wren with an expression Wren could not entirely interpret. Not envy, or not only that, something more complex, the expression of a person recognizing a quality in a situation that has come too late for them and is available only to someone else. "She talks to you," Eleanor said to Roland with a kind of wondering flatness. "I never managed to." "We're still learning," Roland said. He glanced at Wren. It was brief, the glance, but she felt the specific weight of it, the way it included her in a we that was not defensive or performative, but simply accurate. Eleanor left at 3 in the afternoon. At the gate, she paused. "Take care of it," she said to Roland, and then, turning to Wren, "Take care of him." Wren met her eyes. "I'm working on it," she said. Eleanor almost smiled. Then she mounted her horse and rode east into the long light and was gone. The hours after her departure had the quality of time that follows large events, not quiet, not peaceful, but suspended, as though the world had taken a breath and not yet decided to let it out. Roland moved through the afternoon's work with his usual deliberateness, but without his usual settledness, the undercurrent of his agitation visible to Wren only in small things, the way he checked the gate latch twice without seeming to notice the repetition, the way he stood at the fence line for a full minute without doing anything to it. She gave him the afternoon. She returned to her desk and her papers and worked on the case she was building for the hearing, sharpening the sequence, testing the logic of each piece against the logic of the whole, looking for the weak points the way she always looked for weak points, because finding them herself was preferable to having Decker find them first. At supper he was quieter than usual, which was saying something. She did not fill the silence with talk. She passed him things when he needed them and ate her own supper and let the quiet be what it needed to be. When the plates were cleared, she said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who is used to not being asked this. "The hearing," he said. "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been building this ranch for 15 years, he said. When Eleanor left, I thought that was the end of the version of it I had imagined, that all I was doing now was maintaining something that had already failed." He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't think that now. I'm not sure when I stopped thinking it." She looked at him. "Somewhere in the past few weeks," he said. He met her eyes. "Somewhere in the middle of watching you work." The lamp burned between them on the table, throwing its warm light across the kitchen, and outside the wind had settled into the register it kept on calm nights, low and even and traversing the land with the patience of something that has always been there and intends to continue. "Roland," she said. "I know what I mean by it," he said. He said it the way of a man who has arrived somewhere ahead of his words and is not pretending otherwise. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and set her hand over his. She did not squeeze. She simply placed it there, as she had placed the key on the nightstand, in the way of things that are being committed to without ceremony. Because ceremony was not the language either of them spoke fluently, and the language they had been finding together these past weeks was quieter than that, and more durable. His hand turned under hers. He held it. They sat like that in the lamplight while the ranch breathed around them, the animals and the wood and the wind and the ordinary faithful continuation of a place that had been waiting, in its mute and patient way, for this exact wait to settle into it. She could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the hearing and about Decker and about the particular smile he had worn when he delivered his documentation, the smile of a man who has decided the outcome in advance. She thought about all the things she had assembled and whether they were enough. And then she made herself stop thinking about whether they were enough, because that direction of thought led only to the same conclusions she had already reached, and the conclusions did not change with additional examination. She thought instead about Roland's hand over hers, about the way he had said, "I know what I mean by it," with the weight of something fully meant. She got up. She took the ledger from the nightstand and carried it to the desk and opened it to the first page, where her name was written in her careful hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took the pen and turned to the page she had been using for the hearing notes and wrote, quickly and without stopping to revise, everything she still needed to accomplish before the hearing. The list was manageable. It was not small, but it was manageable, and she had managed smaller resources for larger problems before. And she would manage this. She closed the ledger. She stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard, at the fence lines she could just make out in the thin light, at the gate standing open as it always did during the night, available. She thought about what Roland had said, that he had stopped thinking of the ranch as something that had already failed, that he was not sure when. She thought she knew when. She was fairly certain she could mark the approximate morning, but she did not need to say it to him. Some things were true before the people involved understood them, as he had said about himself and Eleanor, and the truth of them was not diminished by going unnamed. She put both keys in her coat pocket, for no particular reason except that she wanted them near, and went back to bed. The hearing was in 4 days. She had 4 days. and a complete set of records, and a woman willing to testify, and a hired hand signed account, and a date inconsistency that no amount of pleasant reasoning could explain away. She had, she understood, lying in the dark with the keys in her coat and the coat on the chair beside the bed, everything she needed, not just for the hearing, everything. She closed her eyes and let the house continue around her, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, her mind went quiet when she asked it to. The hearing lasted most of a morning. It was held in the main room of the land office, which was not a large room and became considerably smaller as it filled with the people who had reason to be present. The panel of 3 men who held authority over property disputes in that territory sat behind a long table at the far end, their expressions carrying the careful neutrality of men who have learned through long practice to withhold their reactions until the complete picture is before them. Decker's advocate occupied the table to the left, a man from the nearest large town, well dressed in the way of someone whose confidence is partly professional and partly the product of having won more often than he has lost. Casper sat in the back row with his written account folded in the inner pocket of his coat, his posture the posture of a person who has done something difficult and is waiting to see whether it was worth it. The notary from the county seat, a small, precise woman who had traveled at Wren's written request and who wore the expression of someone whose professional records are not often questioned and who finds the experience of being questioned distasteful, sat to the right with her own documents in a neat stack on her knee. Eleanor arrived precisely on time. She came through the door without looking at her brother and sat in the front row and folded her hands in her lap, and did not move them for the duration of the morning. Decker sat across the room from Roland and Wren and wore the expression he always wore, pleasant, measured, the expression of a man who has already decided how things will conclude, and is simply waiting for the formalities to confirm it. He looked at Wren once when she came in, a brief and comprehensive assessment, and then he looked away and did not look at her again, which she understood as its own kind of information. The advocate presented first. He spoke at length about family legacy and rightful inheritance and the natural obligations owed to those left behind by the departed. He was skilled at his work. His language was precise without being cold, his manner confident without being aggressive, and he placed the estate document before the panel with the ease of a man laying down a hand he believes cannot be beaten. He was, Wren acknowledged to herself with the fairness she tried to apply even to people working against her, very good at what he did. She listened to all of it without looking at him. She watched the panel. She watched their eyes move over the documents, their hands make occasional small notes, their faces hold their careful stillness. She was looking for what she had been looking for since she first understood the shape of what Decker had done. The moment when the pattern would become visible to someone else. The moment when the pieces arranged themselves for another set of eyes the way they had arranged themselves for hers. When the advocate finished, she stood. She had thought about how she would speak. What she had decided was that the most persuasive thing she could offer was not persuasion at all. It was sequence. The truth, in her experience, did not require embellishment. It required arrangement. It required that the pieces be placed in the right order and trusted to speak. She presented 3 things. The first was the date inconsistency in the estate document. She walked the panel through the registration records and the death notice with the unhurried patience of a teacher who trusts her students to arrive at the conclusion themselves when the path is properly lit. She did not tell them what to think about what they were seeing. She showed them what was there and let the gap between the dates be what it was, a gap that had no innocent explanation. The second was Casper's account. She summarized it briefly and then submitted it in its original signed form. And she noted for the panel that the man who had written and signed it was present in the room and available to answer questions if the panel wished. Casper straightened slightly in the back row and did not speak, but his presence was its own kind of testimony. A person who has written something damaging about themselves and sat in the room where it would be read is a person who believes what they have written is true. The third was the pattern of payments in the ranch ledger, cross-referenced with the dates of Decker's known visits to the region. She did not use the word conspiracy. She did not use the word fraud. She used the word pattern, and she showed the panel what the pattern looked like when the numbers were arranged correctly, and she trusted them to name it themselves. The advocate attempted a rebuttal on the date inconsistency, proposing a theory of administrative delay that he delivered with the confidence of a man who believes confidence is itself a form of evidence. Wren waited for him to finish and then indicated that the notary who had processed the amendment was present and could speak to the actual timeline directly. The notary confirmed in the flat, precise language of a professional who measures her words before releasing them that the amendment had been presented to her after the death was registered and that she had not independently verified the signatory's capacity at the time because she had not been given reason to question it. The advocate's theory did not survive contact with the notary. Eleanor was invited to speak. She stood and turned to face the panel, and she spoke in the quiet voice of a person who has decided, after a long time of deciding otherwise, that the truth is the remaining option. She gave an account of her father's last months that was careful and specific and entirely without drama, the narrowing of his world, the replacement of his own judgment with her brother's management, the visitors who stopped coming, the man her father had been, and the man he had become by the end. The difference between those two men, which was not the ordinary difference that age and illness create, but something more deliberate than that. When Eleanor sat down, the room was very quiet. Decker looked at his advocate. The advocate looked at his papers. The panel looked at the documents spread before them and then at each other. The deliberation took less than 30 minutes. The outcome, when it came, arrived in plain language. The estate document had been executed under circumstances that did not meet the requirements for validity. The amendment was set aside. The claim against Vess Ranch was dismissed. The panel said there were other questions remaining, questions that belonged to other rooms and other days. Wren noted this and let it go. It was not her fight. Hers was finished. Decker received this information with his face arranged in its habitual pleasantness, which was, she thought, the most honest expression she had ever seen on him. The mask holding because the man beneath it had decided long ago that the mask was more useful than whatever was underneath. He spoke briefly to his advocate in a voice too low to carry, and then he stood and he left the room without looking at anyone, and the door closed behind him with an ordinary sound, no drama in it, just the closing of a door. Wren sat for a moment after everyone began to move. She looked at the documents in front of her. All her careful work, the weeks of evenings at the desk, the notations and cross-references, and the long columns of figures that had refused to lie even when everything around them was arranged to obscure them. She felt the particular exhaustion that follows sustained precision, the depletion of having held many things in the right order for a long time and now being released from the holding. Roland's hand came to rest on her shoulder, brief and then gone. But she felt the specific weight of it, not comfort exactly, Something more direct than comfort. The acknowledgement of a person who has seen what you did and understands what it cost. She gathered her papers. She stood. Outside, the light was the high, clear light of late morning moving toward noon. The sky enormous and entirely without cloud. The kind of day that makes the land look as though it is making a statement. Eleanor was waiting at the foot of the step. She had the look of a person who has completed something and is standing in the particular hollow that follows completion before the next thing makes itself known. She looked at Roland and then at Wren, and what she said was addressed to both of them, though she looked at Roland when she said it. "It's finished," she said. "Yes," Roland said. "I'll be leaving soon. For good, I think." She said it without hesitation, which meant she had decided it before this morning, and the morning had only confirmed what was already true. "I have no reason to stay in this part of the country. I'll make arrangements to remove my name from anything that should be yours alone. I don't want it to take longer than it needs to." "Take the time you need," Roland said. "I want it done," she said simply. She looked at Wren. In the outdoor light, she looked older than she had looked across the kitchen table in the early morning, or perhaps simply more visible. The lines of her face clearer in the unsparing brightness of noon. "You did something I should have done years ago," she said. "You looked at what was actually there." "You came to the hearing," Wren said. "That was harder." Eleanor considered this. "Perhaps," she said. Then, "Take care of this place." She said it as though the place were a person, which Wren was beginning to understand it was, in the way that places tended by people over many years absorb something of the tending and give it back. "It deserves it." She said goodbye without ceremony and walked away down the street and into the ordinary morning, and Wren watched her go with the respect she held for people who do the hard thing when the easier option is still technically available. They did not speak much on the ride home. The land opened around them as it always did, vast and unhurried and entirely uninterested in the proceedings of the morning. Wren rode Marsh with the ease that had developed over weeks of daily riding, the mare's movement familiar now beneath her, the rhythm of it as natural as the rhythm of the work she had come to think of as hers. Roland rode beside her, and the distance between them had the quality of distances between people who are no longer measuring it. At the gate he dismounted and held it, and she rode through and waited while he latched it behind them. The small ritual of this, the gate, the latch, the waiting, had the texture of things that have been repeated enough to become the fabric of ordinary days rather than individual acts, and she noticed this without commenting on it, simply noted it the way she noted things she wanted to hold. In the barn, she unsaddled Marsh and brushed her down with the thoroughness she had learned from watching Roland. And the barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses and the particular mineral quality of the earth here that she had come to find not foreign but familiar. She could hear him in the next stall, the long strokes of the brush against his horse's flank, and the barn was easy around them in the way that places are easy when the people in them do not need to fill the silence. She finished with Marsh and stood for a moment with her hand resting on the mare's neck. "Wren," he said. She looked over the partition. He had stopped working. He stood in the opening of the stall with the brush still in his hand and looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his most unguarded one. The expression that appeared when he had decided to say something before he had fully decided how to say it and had committed anyway. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I want to tell you. I have been thinking about it since this morning, and I have not been able to find words that are adequate to what I mean, which is a problem I seem to have frequently with things that matter." He paused. "But I have learned that waiting for the right words sometimes means the thing goes unsaid, so I am going to say it with the words I have." She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the ranch. Not because of the contract or the legal matter or the practical arrangement of two people sharing a house. I want you to stay because this place did not make sense to me anymore before you came, and it makes sense now. And the thing that changed is not the land or the work or any circumstance I can point to. The thing that changed is that you are here." He set the brush down carefully on the stall rail. "And I would like you to keep being here, for the duration of whatever here turns out to be." The barn held its warm, dim stillness around them. The horses breathed in their stalls. Light came through the upper boards in the amber-edged way of afternoon light, the kind that makes everything look briefly and precisely itself. She came around the partition and stood before him. She looked up at his face, at the particular arrangement of it that she had been learning for weeks, all the gradations and the small movements that carried everything he did not say in words. "I came back on a Wednesday," she said. "I remember. I came back a day early because I wanted to come back, not because the business was finished, because I wanted to be here." She held his gaze. "I have been wanting to be here for longer than I admitted to myself. Long enough that when you gave me the house key, I already knew what I was going to do with it." He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had taken it across the kitchen table the night before, with the straightforward care of a man who has decided that the thing he is holding matters and intends to hold it properly. "I am not going to become a different person," he said. "I am still going to be quiet at the wrong times, and I am still going to stand at the fence and look at nothing for 10 minutes, and I am going to forget sometimes that other people cannot follow the thought I am having, because I have not said it out loud." "I know," she said. "I am still going to read your ledgers without asking permission, and I am still going to write letters to people before I tell you about it, and I am going to spend evenings working at the desk when you would perhaps prefer conversation." "I know," he said. "We are not easy people," she said. "No," he said. "But we are the same kind of difficult." She looked at him for a moment. Then she lifted her free hand and set it against the side of his face, and he went still at the touch, and she felt the exact moment when the last of the held-back thing left him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet way of things that have been waiting for permission and have finally received it. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, brief and without performance, the gesture of a person speaking in the only language that was, in that moment, precise enough. That evening she brought the ledger to the kitchen table. The lamp was lit, and the fire was built up against the cool of the autumn evening, and the kitchen had the warmth of a room that has been used for a long time by people who know how to use it. She set the ledger on the table and opened it to the first page, and she looked at her name written there in her own hand, the letters clear and unhesitating, the hand of a woman who had known her own name even in the weeks when everything else had been uncertain. She picked up the pen. Beside her name, she wrote 2 additional letters and a surname. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she turned to the page she kept for household accounts and began the evening's entries with the deliberate care she brought to all of it, the ordinary arithmetic of a life in progress, what was needed and what was on hand, and what would need to be planned for, and what would simply have to be met as it arrived. Roland sat across from her with the fence records he had been meaning to update, and the lamp between them threw its warm circle across the table, and the kitchen settled into the sounds of a household at the end of a significant day finding its way back to the ordinary. The fire, the pen, the occasional movement of the horses in the barn, audible through the walls on still evenings, the wind at the eaves, which had become by now as familiar as any voice. He looked up from his records after a while, and looked at her across the lamp, and she felt his gaze, and looked up and met it. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said. And what had been said was enough, more than enough, sufficient to last them through the winter and into whatever came after, sufficient to be going on with in the way that genuine things are sufficient when they have been arrived at honestly. She returned to the ledger. He returned to his records. The evening continued. Later, after the lamp had been turned down and the fire banked for the night, she stood at the window of her room in the dark and looked out at the yard. The gate stood open, as it always did in the night hours. The iron letter worked into the arch, barely visible in the thin starlight, patient and permanent, and exactly as it had been on the evening she first walked through it with 2 bags and a plan that extended no further than the next hour. She thought about that evening, the long road from the town, the amber light that had made everything look briefly significant, the barn and the low voice, and the man who had not looked up immediately, who had let her stand in the doorway for a moment before he acknowledged her, not from rudeness, but from the same quality that made him stand at the fence for 10 minutes, looking at nothing. The quality of a person who needs a moment to arrange himself before he can be useful to anyone. She thought about the lock on the door, the key on the nightstand, the 2 cups every morning, which had begun as her habit and had become, she understood now, something else, the shape of a day that expected her presence, that had adjusted itself to include her. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the keys there, both of them, the one he had left for her and the one he had given her later, worn smooth with weeks of handling. She thought about what she had written in the ledger, her name, and then the addition beside it. The simplest possible record of something that had already been true for longer than the writing of it. She was not a woman given to dramatic conclusions. She did not believe in the kind of happiness that arrived fully formed and announced itself. She believed in the kind that assembled itself slowly from small true things. A lock, a cup of coffee, a hand taken across a table, a man who stood in a barn doorway and found the words he needed even when the words were not adequate and said them anyway. She believed in the kind of happiness that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than 2 people in a kitchen at the end of an evening, each doing their own work by lamplight, neither of them alone. She turned from the window and set her coat on the chair and lay down on the bed in the dark. The house breathed around her with the easy respiration of a place at rest, the small adjustments of wood in the cooling night air, the distant reassurance of the animals in the barn, the wind moving over the roof in its habitual patient way, crossing the land as it always had and always would, indifferent to the particular lives it passed over, and in its indifference, somehow, a kind of faithfulness. She closed her eyes. Outside, the stars turned very slowly in their ancient courses, doing what they had always done, enormous and unhurried, and exactly where they were supposed to be. And in a kitchen down the hall, On the first page of a ledger that had begun as an empty book carried by a woman who was not sure what she intended to fill it with, two names sat beside each other in clear, unhesitating ink. Not a promise, not a declaration, a record. The kind that does not change. The kind that says, this is what was true, and this is when it became true, and it will remain true in the pages that follow. She let the house hold her, and she did not wait for sleep. It came.